A fever-sick teenager stumbles onto Wade Hollis's Montana ranch, carrying his silent little sister and $12, everything he owns. But Eli Mercer doesn't beg for food. He whispers a question that shatters Wade's carefully guarded solitude. If I die tonight, who'll feed my sister? What begins as a dying boy's desperate bargain becomes a blood-soaked stand against armed riders, a battle for belonging, and a promise that will either resurrect Wade's broken heart or bury him beside the ghosts he spent a decade trying to forget. If this story grabs you, stay until the end, and drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this tale travels. Hit that like button and let's ride. The wind across the Montana grassland had a loneliness to it that Wade Hollis had long since stopped fighting. It moved through the tall grass in waves, bending everything in its path, indifferent and endless. He stood on his porch in the failing light of an October evening, coffee gone cold in his tin cup, watching the horizon where the sky bled orange into purple. The land stretched flat and empty in every direction, broken only by the dark line of cottonwoods that marked the creek bed half a mile south. He liked it that way. Empty. Predictable. The ranch house behind him was weathered gray wood and stone, 2 stories with a sagging roof that leaked in spring and groaned under snow in winter. He'd built most of it himself 20 years ago, back when he'd believed in futures that included more than one name on a deed. Now the rooms upstairs stayed closed. The kitchen table had 1 chair. The silence suited him. Wade was 43 and looked older. His face was all hard angles and sun damage, deep lines carved around his eyes and mouth. His hair, once dark, had gone mostly gray at the temples. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, and moved with the deliberate economy of a man who'd learned not to waste motion. His hands were scarred and calloused, knuckles thick from a lifetime of work and a few fights he hadn't walked away from cleanly. He drained the last of his coffee and turned to go inside when he saw them. 2 shapes moving slow across the grassland, small against the vast emptiness. At first he thought it was a trick of the light, shadows thrown long by the setting sun. But they kept coming, unsteady and deliberate, and Wade set his cup down on the porch rail and watched. A boy and a girl. The boy was tall, maybe 16, stumbling every few steps like his legs couldn't quite hold him. The girl was small, no more than 7 or 8, clinging to his hand. They were a quarter-mile out, moving toward the house with the kind of determination that came from having no other choice. Wade didn't move. He watched them close the distance, watched the boy fall once and drag himself back up, the girl pulling at his arm. When they were close enough for Wade to see their faces, something cold settled in his chest. The boy's skin was flushed and slick with sweat despite the cool evening air. His eyes were glassy, unfocused. The girl's face was streaked with dirt and tears, her clothes torn and filthy. They looked like they'd walked through hell and kept going on the other side. Wade stepped down off the porch and crossed the yard to meet them. The boy stopped 10 feet away, swaying on his feet, and locked eyes with Wade. Up close, Wade could see the fever burning in him, the way his whole body trembled with the effort of standing. "Mister," the boy said, his voice rough and cracking, "I need to ask you something." Wade said nothing. He looked at the girl, who stared back at him with wide, frightened eyes. She hadn't let go of her brother's hand. The boy took a breath that rattled in his chest, wet and labored. "If I die tonight," he said, each word deliberate, "who'll feed my sister?" The question landed like a blow. Wade felt something crack open inside him, something he'd kept sealed shut for a long time. He looked at the boy, really looked at him, and saw the truth written in every shaking line of his body. This wasn't a question. It was a last will, spoken out loud. "What's your name?" Wade asked, his voice rougher than he'd intended. "Eli Mercer." The boy swayed again, caught himself. "This is Mara. She's 7. "You sick, Eli?" "Lung fever, 3 days now." Eli's legs buckled and Wade caught him by the arm, felt the unnatural heat radiating through his shirt. The boy didn't fight it, just let Wade hold him upright. Walked from Stillwater, had to get her somewhere safe. Wade looked at the girl, Mara. She hadn't made a sound. Her eyes were locked on her brother, watching him like she was afraid if she looked away, he'd disappear. "Why here?" Wade asked. Eli fumbled in his pocket and pulled out a small cloth bundle, pressed it into Wade's hand. Wade unfolded it. $12 in worn bills and loose coins. "It's all I got," Eli said. "It's enough to feed her for a while. Just until you can find someone who'll take her proper. I'm not asking you to keep her. I'm asking you to keep her alive." Wade stared at the money, then at the boy, and felt the weight of what was being offered settle onto his shoulders like a physical thing. This wasn't charity. It was a transaction born of absolute desperation. "I don't want your money," Wade said quietly. Eli's eyes filled with something close to panic. "Please, I can't." He broke off, coughing, and the sound was deep and wet, tearing up from his lungs. When he could breathe again, he looked at Wade with a kind of raw honesty that cut straight through. "I'm dying. I know it. But she's not. She deserves better than what I can give her now." Wade looked at Mara again. She was watching him now, not her brother, and in her eyes he saw something he recognized. The kind of fear that came from being too young to understand why the world was cruel, only that it was. He closed his hand around the money and shoved it back into Eli's pocket. "Keep it," he said. "Both of you, come inside." Eli's legs gave out completely then, and Wade caught him before he hit the ground, scooped him up like he weighed nothing. The boy was burning up, his breathing shallow and labored. Mara followed without a word, her small hand clutching the back of Wade's coat as he carried her brother up the porch steps and into the house. The house smelled like wood smoke and coffee and old leather. Wade kicked the door shut behind them and carried Eli through the main room, sparse and functional, a stone fireplace, a few chairs, a table with one setting, and into the room at the back of the first floor. It had been a bedroom once. Wade hadn't opened the door in 8 years. He shouldered it open and laid Eli on the narrow bed, the mattress thin and the quilt faded but clean. Mara climbed up beside her brother immediately, curling against his side like she could anchor him to the world through sheer proximity. Wade stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at them. The room was small, the walls bare except for a single shelf that still held a child's wooden horse, hand-carved and gathering dust. He forced himself to turn away, to focus on what needed doing. "Stay here," he said to Mara. "I'm going to get water and medicine." She didn't answer, didn't even look at him. Her eyes were fixed on Eli, who had already slipped into unconsciousness, his breathing rough and uneven. Wade moved fast. He stoked the fire in the main room, set a kettle to boil, and pulled down the tin box from the high shelf in the kitchen where he kept what little medicine he had: willow bark for fever, dried herbs for coughs, a bottle of whiskey for when nothing else worked. He grabbed clean rags, a basin, and filled it with cold water from the pump outside. When he came back into the room, Mara was exactly where he'd left her, pressed against her brother's side. She looked up when Wade set the basin down, her eyes tracking his every movement. "What's your name?" Wade asked, keeping his voice low and even. She didn't answer. "All right," Wade said. "You don't have to talk, but I need you to move so I can help him." She hesitated, then slowly shifted to the foot of the bed, never taking her eyes off Eli. Wade soaked a rag in the cold water and pressed it to the boy's forehead, felt the heat radiating off him in waves. Eli stirred, murmured something incoherent, but didn't wake. Wade worked methodically, cooling Eli's skin, forcing bitter willow bark tea between his cracked lips when the water boiled. The boy choked on it, coughed violently, but some of it went down. Wade kept at it, patient and deliberate, the way he'd done this before, years ago, in the same room. He didn't let himself think about that. Hours passed. The fire burned low and Wade fed it, kept the room warm but not stifling. Eli's fever spiked and broke and spiked again, his body shaking with chills one moment and burning the next. Wade stayed close, changing the rags, dosing him with tea, monitoring his breathing. Mara never moved from the foot of the bed. She watched everything Wade did with the intensity of a small animal trying to decide if it was safe. Once when Eli's breathing turned ragged and shallow, she made a small, strangled sound, the first noise Wade had heard from her, and reached for her brother's hand. "He's fighting," Wade said quietly. "That's good. Means he's strong." Mara's eyes flicked to him, then back to Eli. She didn't let go of his hand. Somewhere past midnight, Eli woke. His eyes opened, unfocused and glassy, and he looked around the room like he couldn't remember where he was. His gaze landed on Wade, sitting in a chair beside the bed, and something sharpened in his expression. "Mara," he whispered, his voice barely there. "Right here," Wade said, nodding toward the foot of the bed. "She hasn't left your side." Eli turned his head, saw his sister, and some of the tension bled out of his body. He tried to speak again, coughed instead, and Wade helped him sit up enough to drink a little water. "You promised," Eli said when he could breathe again. The words came slow, deliberate. "If I die?" "You're not dying," Wade said flatly. "Not tonight." "You don't know that." "I know you're still breathing. That's enough for now." Eli studied him for a long moment, his fever-bright eyes searching Wade's face for something. "Why are you helping us?" Wade looked away, toward the window where the darkness pressed close against the glass. "Because you asked." "That's not a reason." "It's the only one you're getting." Eli was quiet for a moment, then said, "The money. I told you to keep it. It's all I got to pay you with." Wade turned back to him, his voice hard. "I don't want your money, boy. I want you to shut up and rest so you don't die in my house and make a liar out of me." Eli blinked, startled, and then, impossibly, the corner of his mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but close. "Yes, sir." Wade stood, moved toward the door. "Get some sleep, both of you." "Mr. Hollis?" Wade stopped, turned back. "If I do die," Eli said, his voice steady despite the exhaustion pulling at him, "promise me you won't let her think I left her on purpose. Promise me she'll know I tried." Wade felt that crack inside him widen, felt something old and aching push through. He looked at Mara, still silent at the foot of the bed, her small hand wrapped around her brother's, and he thought of another child, another promise, another room that had stayed closed for too long. "I promise," Wade said. The words came out rough, but they came. "But you're not dying. Not if I have anything to say about it." Eli nodded, his eyes already closing, and Wade left the room, pulling the door half shut behind him. He stood in the main room for a long time, staring at the dying fire, feeling the weight of what he'd just taken on settle into his bones. He'd meant to live out his days alone, to let the past stay buried and the house stay quiet. But now there were children under his roof again, and one of them was fighting for his life. And Wade couldn't walk away from that even if he wanted to. He thought about the question Eli had asked on the porch. "Who'll feed my sister?" Wade had lost the right to answer questions like that a long time ago. He'd failed once, failed in the worst way a man could fail, and he'd built his solitude around that failure like a wall. But the boy had asked anyway, and Wade had answered. He fed the fire, made more tea, and settled into the chair by the hearth to wait for morning. Sleep didn't come, but he hadn't expected it to. He'd learned to live without a lot of things. Sleep was one of them. Dawn broke cold and gray, the sky heavy with the promise of snow. Wade woke stiff in the chair, his back protesting as he stood and moved to check on Eli. The boy was still asleep, his breathing steadier than it had been during the night, his fever lower. Mara was curled up beside him, one small hand still holding his, her face finally peaceful in sleep. Wade left them and went outside to tend the animals, 2 horses in the barn, a handful of chickens, a milk cow. The work was familiar, grounding. He fed and watered, mucked stalls, and tried not to think about what came next. When he came back inside, Mara was awake. She was sitting on the floor beside the bed, watching Eli sleep, and she looked up when Wade entered. Her eyes were dark and wary, like a wild thing that hadn't decided if it was safe to trust yet. "You hungry?" Wade asked. She didn't answer, but her eyes tracked him as he moved to the stove and started breakfast, bacon, eggs, biscuits. Simple food, but there was plenty of it. He set a plate on the table, poured a cup of milk, and stepped back. "Eat," he said. Mara didn't move. Wade sighed, pulled out the chair, and sat down. He ate his own breakfast in silence, not looking at her, giving her space to decide. After a few minutes, he heard the soft scrape of her feet on the floor, and when he glanced up, she was at the table, one hand reaching tentatively for the biscuit. She ate like she was starving, fast, focused, barely pausing to breathe. Wade let her, didn't say anything, just refilled her milk when the cup was empty and pushed another biscuit toward her when the first was gone. When she finally slowed down, he said quietly, "There's more if you want it. You don't have to rush." She looked at him, really looked at him, and he saw the question in her eyes. Why are you being kind? He didn't have an answer that would make sense to a 7-year-old. Hell, he didn't have one that made sense to himself. Your brother's going to need food when he wakes up, Wade said instead. I'll make soup. You can help if you want. Mara didn't answer, but when Wade moved to the stove and started chopping vegetables, she followed, standing just close enough to watch what he was doing without getting in the way. They worked in silence, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the rhythmic chop of the knife against the cutting board. Wade showed her how to peel potatoes, how to slice carrots thin, and she mimicked his movements with the careful precision of a child who'd learned early to pay attention. When the soup was simmering, Wade heard movement from the back room, a cough, the creak of the bed. He grabbed a bowl and ladled soup into it, carried it back with a hunk of bread, and found Eli awake, propped up against the wall, his face pale, but his eyes clearer than they'd been the night before. You look like hell, Wade said, setting the bowl on the small table beside the bed. Feel worse, Eli said, his voice hoarse. He looked past Wade to where Mara stood in the doorway. You okay, Mara? She nodded. She eat? Wade answered for her. Like a wolf. Eli's mouth twitched. Good. He looked back at Wade. I remember asking you something last night. Can't remember if you answered. I answered. What'd you say? Wade met his eyes, steady. I said you're not dying. Not on my watch. Eli held his gaze for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. You've got a long fight ahead of you. I know. Wade handed him the soup. Eat. You need your strength. Eli ate slowly, his hands shaking with the effort, but he got most of it down. When he was done, he set the bowl aside and leaned back against the wall, exhausted. How long were you walking? Wade asked. 3 days? Maybe 4. Lost track. From Stillwater? Yeah. Wade knew Stillwater, a rough town 30 miles east, the kind of place where men went to forget and women went to disappear. What were you doing there? Eli's expression shuddered. Working, trying to keep us fed. What kind of work? Whatever I could get, hauling freight, mucking stables, running errands. He paused, then added quietly, Our pa died 6 months ago. Left us nothing but debts. Wade absorbed that, the pieces starting to fit together. What about your ma? Died when Mara was born. No other family? No one who'd take us in. Wade looked at Mara, still standing silent in the doorway, and felt that old ache twist in his chest. So you walked 30 miles with lung fever to bring your sister to a stranger. Didn't have a choice. Eli's voice was flat, matter of fact. Stillwater's no place for a kid, and I knew I was getting worse, figured if I could just get her somewhere safe before... He broke off, coughed. Before I couldn't anymore. Why my place? Eli looked at him, something unreadable in his eyes. Someone in town said you were a hard man, but a fair one. Said you didn't turn folks away if they needed help. Wade snorted. Whoever told you that doesn't know me very well. Maybe they do. Wade didn't have an answer for that. He stood, picked up the empty bowl. You need rest. I'll check on you later. Eli caught his wrist, his grip weak but insistent. If something happens, nothing's going to happen. If it does, Wade pulled free, his voice harder than he'd intended. You made me promise last night. I don't go back on my word. So you're going to stop talking like you're dying and focus on getting better. Understood? Eli stared at him, and slowly, something like hope flickered in his fever-bright eyes. Understood. Wade left the room, closed the door behind him, and stood in the hallway for a moment, trying to steady himself. He hadn't asked for this, hadn't wanted it, but the boy had asked the one question Wade couldn't turn away from, and now there were children in his house again, and the past he'd tried so hard to bury was clawing its way back to the surface. He looked at Mara, who had followed him out and was standing a few feet away, watching him with those dark, wary eyes. You don't have to be scared here, Wade said quietly. I'm not going to hurt you. She didn't answer, but something shifted in her expression. Just a flicker, barely there, but Wade saw it. The smallest easing of tension, the first fragile thread of trust. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The days that followed fell into a rhythm. Wade tended the ranch and tended Eli, keeping the boy fed and dosed with medicine, watching for any sign that the fever was winning. Mara shadowed Wade during the day, silent and watchful, and sat beside her brother at night, a small sentinel who never seemed to sleep. Eli improved slowly. The fever broke on the third day, leaving him weak and hollowed out, but alive. He slept most of the time, his body fighting to recover the strength the illness had stolen. When he was awake, he and Wade talked, short, careful conversations that skirted around the things that mattered most. Wade learned that Eli was 16, that he'd been working since he was 12 to keep himself and Mara fed after their father started drinking away what little money they had. He learned that Eli had tried to protect Mara from the worst of it, had taken beatings meant for her, had stolen food when there was no other way. He learned that the $12 Eli had offered him had been earned over 2 months of back-breaking work in Stillwater, and that Eli had been planning to use it to get them farther west, to a place where no one knew them and they could start over. He learned that when Eli had realized he was dying, he'd walked those 30 miles, not because he thought Wade would take Mara permanently, but because he believed Wade would keep her alive long enough to find someone who would. The boy had carried his sister into the unknown on nothing but a stranger's reputation, and the faint hope that decency still existed somewhere in the world. It made Wade's chest ache in a way he hadn't felt in years. Mara, for her part, remained silent. She ate when food was offered, slept when exhaustion overtook her, and followed Wade like a shadow during his daily chores. She watched him chop wood, mend fences, feed the animals. She learned where he kept things, how he moved through his day, the small rituals that made up his solitary life. She didn't speak, but she was always listening. On the 5th day, Wade was in the barn repairing a broken saddle when he heard footsteps behind him. He turned and found Mara standing in the doorway, backlit by the afternoon sun. "Something wrong?" he asked. She shook her head, stepped inside, and walked over to where he was working. She stood there for a moment, watching, then reached out and touched the leather, her small fingers tracing the stitching he was repairing. Wade watched her, waiting. "Can I help?" she asked. Her voice was soft, hesitant, the first word she'd spoken since she'd arrived. Wade felt something loosen in his chest. "Yeah," he said quietly. "You can hold this piece steady while I stitch it." She moved closer, her small hands taking the leather where he indicated, and they worked together in silence, the only sounds the rasp of thread through leather and the soft rustle of wind through the barn. When the repair was done, Mara stepped back and looked up at him. "Is Eli going to be okay?" "Yeah," Wade said. "He's going to be okay." "Promise?" Wade crouched down so he was at her eye level. "I promise." She studied his face for a long moment, then nodded. "Okay." It was the first time she'd smiled, and it was small and fleeting, but Wade saw it. And for the first time in a long time, he felt like maybe, just maybe, he was doing something right. The threat came on the 6th day. Wade was outside splitting wood when he heard the sound of hooves. He straightened, set the axe down, and turned to see a group of riders coming up the road, 5 men, moving at a steady pace. They weren't locals. Wade knew every rancher within 50 miles, and none of them rode with that kind of purpose. He walked to the house, grabbed his rifle from where it leaned beside the door, and stepped back outside. Mara was on the porch, and he motioned her inside. "Stay with your brother. Don't come out." She hesitated, then nodded and disappeared into the house. Wade waited, the rifle held loose but ready, as the riders closed the distance. They pulled up in the yard, their horses blowing hard, and Wade studied them with the practiced eye of a man who'd learned to read danger. The leader was a tall man with a scar running from his temple to his jaw, his eyes cold and calculating. He wore a long coat and a gun on each hip, and he carried himself with the kind of confidence that came from never losing. "You Wade Hollis?" the man asked. "Who's asking?" The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Name's Rourke Boone. I'm here on behalf of Silas Hackett. You got something that belongs to him." Wade's grip on the rifle tightened. "I don't know what you're talking about. 2 kids, boy and a girl. They stole money from Mr. Hackett, and we're here to collect." "There's no thieves here." Boone's smile widened. "That's not what I heard. See, the boy worked for Mr. Hackett in Stillwater, took off with $12 that didn't belong to him. Mr. Hackett wants it back, and he wants the boy to answer for what he did. Wade kept his voice level. The boy doesn't have your money. Then you won't mind if we take a look. You're not setting foot on my property. Boone's expression didn't change, but something sharp glinted in his eyes. You protecting a thief, Hollis? I'm protecting two starving kids who don't have anything to do with your boss's grudge. Those kids are Hackett's business. They're my business now. Boone leaned forward in his saddle, his voice dropping. You don't want to make an enemy of Silas Hackett. He's got reach, he's got men, and he doesn't forgive. Wade raised the rifle, slow and deliberate, until it was aimed at Boone's chest. Neither do I. For a long moment, no one moved. The yard was silent except for the creak of saddle leather and the soft snort of horses. Boone's men shifted, hands drifting toward their guns, but Wade didn't flinch. Finally, Boone straightened, his smile fading. You're making a mistake. Wouldn't be the first. Boone turned his horse, his men following suit. But before they rode off, he looked back at Wade, his voice cold. We'll be back, and next time we won't ask nice. They spurred their horses and rode out, disappearing down the road in a cloud of dust. Wade stood there until they were out of sight, then lowered the rifle and let out a slow breath. Behind him, the door creaked open. He turned and found Eli standing on the porch, pale and shaking, Mara clutching his hand. Who was that? Eli asked, his voice tight. Wade looked at him, saw the fear in his eyes, and felt the weight of what was coming settle onto his shoulders like iron. Trouble, Wade said quietly, and it's just getting started. Eli stood frozen on the porch, his knuckles white where they gripped the doorframe. The color had drained from his face, leaving him ghost pale except for two fever-bright spots high on his cheeks. Mara pressed against his side, her silence somehow louder than any scream. Wade climbed the steps, rifle still in hand, and moved past them into the house. Inside, now. They followed without argument. Wade set the rifle within reach of the door and turned to face Eli, whose legs had started to shake from the effort of standing. Sit down before you fall down, Wade said, nodding toward the chair. Eli sank into it, his breathing labored. They're going to come back. I know. Hackett doesn't give up. Once he decides something's his, I said I know. Wade's voice was flat, final. He moved to the window, scanned the empty road, the grassland beyond. Nothing moved out there but the wind. You should give us up. Eli's voice cracked on the words. Before he burns your place down, or worse. We're not worth... Wade turned on him, sharp and sudden. Don't tell me what my place is worth, or what you're worth. That's not your call. Eli flinched, but held his ground. He'll kill you. He can try. I'm serious. So am I. Mara had moved to stand beside her brother's chair, one small hand resting on his shoulder. She was looking at Wade with an expression too old for her face, like she'd already lived through this conversation a dozen times before and knew how it ended. Wade softened his voice just slightly. Tell me about Hackett. Everything. Eli took a shaky breath, rubbed his palms against his thighs. Silas Hackett owns half of Stillwater. Saloon, freight company, hotel. If you work in that town, you work for him one way or another. What were you hauling? Whatever needed moving. Crates, supplies, sometimes liquor from the warehouse to the saloon. Eli paused, swallowed hard. My pa worked for him too before he died. Hauling freight, same as me. Pa got hurt. Load shifted wrong and crushed his leg. He couldn't work anymore, but Hackett said he still owed for room and board from when we lived above the stable. How much? $30. Wade's jaw tightened. For what? A year's worth of straw bedding? 6 months. But Hackett kept adding interest. Said Pa owed him for medicine too, for the whiskey he drank to kill the pain. Eli's voice went hollow. Pa drank himself to death trying to forget his leg was ruined. When he died, Hackett said the debt passed to me. That's not legal. Doesn't matter what's legal in Stillwater, Hackett owns the sheriff. Wade turned that over in his mind, the picture getting clearer. So you worked to pay off your pa's debt? Yeah, 12, 14 hours a day, but the debt never got smaller. He He kept adding charges: meals, supplies, a blanket Mara needed when winter came. I asked to see the ledger once, and he had his men throw me into the street. Eli's hands curled into fists. I realized he was never going to let us go. We were going to die there, working ourselves into the ground for nothing. So you took the $12. Eli met his eyes, defiant despite the fear still etched into his face. I earned that $12. 2 months of hauling freight through mud and snow. He owed me wages, and I took what was mine. Did you tell him you were leaving? No, I knew he'd stop me, so I waited until he was drunk at the card table one night, packed what little we had, and we walked. He coughed, winced, didn't think I'd get sick, thought we'd make it farther before. He gestured vaguely at himself, at the weakness still pulling him down. Wade absorbed all of it, the injustice and desperation, the kind of cruelty that wore a respectable face and called itself business. He'd seen it before, in other towns, other men who measured human worth in dollars and didn't care who got crushed in the process. Boone said Hackett has reach, Wade said. How much reach? Enough. He's got men on payroll, not just workers, but guns. Boone's the worst of them. There's talk he killed a man in Billings over a card game, and Hackett got him out of it. Eli's voice dropped. If Boone says they're coming back, they're coming back. Wade walked to the window again, his mind working through possibilities. His ranch was isolated, which was both an advantage and a liability. No one would hear gunfire out here, but anyone approaching would be visible for a mile in every direction. How many men does Hackett have? Maybe a dozen who'd ride for him. Boone brought 5 today, but he could bring more. How loyal are they? Eli considered that. Loyal to money. Hackett pays well. Would they die for him? I don't know. Maybe Boone would. The others? He shrugged. Hard to say. Wade turned back to face them. Eli looked like he was barely holding himself together, and Mara hadn't moved from her brother's side, her small face set in grim determination. Here's what's going to happen, Wade said, his voice calm and deliberate. You two are going to stay inside. You're not going to open the door unless you hear my voice. If shooting starts, you get down in the cellar and you don't come up until I tell you it's safe. You can't fight them alone, Eli protested. I've fought worse odds. It's not up for discussion. Wade's tone left no room for argument. I made you a promise. I'm keeping it. That means keeping you alive, and if Hackett's men want to test me on that, they're going to lose. Eli stared at him, something desperate working behind his eyes. Why? You don't owe us anything. You asked me a question on my porch 6 days ago, Wade said quietly. I answered it. That's the end of it. That's not... It is. Mara spoke then, her voice small but clear. Are you going to die? The question hit Wade harder than it should have. He crouched down so he was at her eye level, the way he had in the barn. No, I'm not going to die, and neither is your brother. That's what I promised, and I don't break promises. She searched his face, looking for the lie, and must not have found one because she nodded slowly. Okay. Wade stood, ruffled her hair, an awkward gesture, unpracticed, and moved toward the door. I'm going to check the fence line, see if they left anyone watching. Stay inside. He took the rifle and went out, leaving them in the quiet of the house. The land around Wade's ranch was deceptive in its openness. It looked flat, empty, but there were draws and coulees hidden in the grassland, places where a man could wait unseen if he knew where to look. Wade walked the perimeter slowly, eyes scanning every shadow, every shift in the landscape. He found tracks near the creek, boot prints and horse droppings still fresh. Someone had been there recently, watching. Wade followed the tracks west for half a mile until they met the road and disappeared into harder ground. Whoever it was had left, but the message was clear. They were being watched. When Wade returned to the house, the sun was dropping toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of copper and ash. He found Eli asleep in the chair, exhausted from the confrontation, and Mara sitting on the floor beside him with the wooden horse from the shelf, turning it over in her hands. She looked up when Wade entered. I found this. You can keep it, Wade said. She held it carefully, like it might break. Whose was it? Wade hesitated, the old grief stirring. Someone who doesn't need it anymore. Mara looked at him with those two old eyes and seemed to understand what he wasn't saying. She set the horse gently on the floor beside her. "Thank you." Wade nodded, moved to stoke the fire. The room filled with warmth and the crackle of burning wood. He made dinner, venison stew, biscuits, and when Eli woke, they ate together at the table. It was the first time all three of them had sat down to a meal, and the silence felt different than before. Less wary, almost comfortable. After dinner, Wade showed Eli the cellar, a small room dug into the earth beneath the kitchen, accessible through a trapdoor. It was cool and dark, stocked with preserved food and a water barrel. "If trouble comes and I tell you to get down here, you don't argue," Wade said. "You take Mara and you stay quiet until I come for you." Eli nodded, his jaw tight. "I should be helping you fight." "You can barely stand without shaking. You'd be a liability, not help." "I'm not a coward." "Didn't say you were. But you've got a job more important than fighting. You keep your sister safe. That's all that matters." Eli looked like he wanted to argue, but the truth of it settled over him, and he nodded again, slower this time. "All right." They went back upstairs. Wade checked the rifle, the revolver on his hip, counted ammunition. Not enough for a prolonged fight, but enough to make anyone who came for them think twice. As night fell, Wade sent Eli and Mara to bed and took up watch by the window. The darkness outside was absolute, broken only by starlight and the thin crescent of a moon. He sat in the chair with the rifle across his knees, listening to the sounds of the house settling, the wind moving through the eaves. Hours passed. Midnight came and went. Wade didn't sleep. He watched the horizon, the road, the dark line of cottonwoods by the creek. Nothing moved. Just before dawn, he heard it, the distant sound of hooves, faint but unmistakable. Wade stood, moved to the door, and stepped outside into the pre-dawn chill. They came with the sunrise. 8 riders this time, Boone at the front. They rode in a loose line, spread out, and pulled up just beyond rifle range. Boone sat his horse easy, relaxed, like he had all the time in the world. Wade stepped down off the porch, rifle in hand, and walked out to meet them. He stopped 50 feet from the house, far enough that they couldn't rush him without giving him time to shoot. "Told you we'd be back," Boone called. "So you did." "You had time to think about what I said. You ready to be reasonable?" "I'm ready for you to turn around and leave." Boone smiled, that same cold smile from before. "Can't do that. Mr. Hackett wants what's his." "The boy doesn't belong to Hackett." "The boy's a thief. Hackett's entitled to justice." "Hackett's entitled to nothing." One of the other riders spoke up, a younger man with a nervous edge to his voice. "We don't want trouble, Hollis. Just hand over the boy and we'll go." "Not happening." Boone raised a hand, silencing the younger man. "You're outnumbered 8-1. You think you can take all of us?" "I think I can take enough of you that the rest will wish they'd stayed in Stillwater." Boone studied him, measuring, and Wade saw the calculation happening behind those cold eyes. Boone was trying to decide if Wade was bluffing, if he had the sand to actually pull the trigger. Wade let him wonder. "Last chance," Boone said. "Give us the boy." Wade didn't answer. He just stood there, rifle ready, and let the silence stretch. Boone's smile faded. "All right then, have it your way." He turned his horse and rode back toward the others. They gathered in a tight group, voices low, gesturing toward the house. Wade watched them, his pulse steady, his mind clear. He counted exits, angles, cover. The porch would give him some protection. The corner of the barn offered a better position, but left the house exposed. He was still weighing his options when Boone and his men turned their horses and rode off. Wade stood there, watching until they disappeared over the rise. Then he lowered the rifle and let out a slow breath. They were leaving, but they weren't done. Wade spent the day preparing. He moved supplies into the house: water, ammunition, food. He checked the doors, the windows, reinforced the shutters with spare planks. He showed Eli how to bar the back door from the inside and where the spare revolver was hidden in the kitchen. "If they get past me, you use that," Wade said. "You understand?" Eli's face was pale but determined. "I understand." Mara watched from the corner, silent as always, but her eyes tracked everything Wade did. She was learning, absorbing, preparing herself for what might come. That afternoon, Wade rode out to the nearest neighbor, Graham Bridger, a rancher who ran cattle 5 miles south. Wade and Graham weren't friends exactly, but they'd helped each other over the years the way neighbors did when the land was hard and people were scarce. Graham was a broad-shouldered man in his 50s, weathered and practical. He listened to Wade's explanation without interrupting, his expression growing darker with each detail. "Hackett," Graham said when Wade finished. "I've heard of him. Heard he runs Stillwater like his own private kingdom." "He does. And now he's coming after you for protecting a couple of kids." "That's the shape of it." Graham was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then he said, "How many men you figure he'll bring?" "More than I can handle alone." "You asking for help?" Wade met his eyes. "I'm letting you know there might be trouble on your doorstep if things go bad. Didn't want you caught unaware." Graham snorted. "That's not an answer." "It's the only one I've got." "Wade, you stubborn bastard." Graham shook his head, but there was something like respect in his voice. "You helped me through that drought 3 years back. Gave me water when you didn't have enough for yourself. I don't forget things like that. You don't owe me anything. Maybe not. But if Hackett thinks he can ride into this valley and push folks around, he's going to learn different." Graham turned toward his barn, raised his voice. "Lucas, saddle up. We're riding." A young man emerged from the barn, Graham's son, tall and lean. "Where are we going?" "Wade's place, and bring your rifle." Lucas nodded and disappeared back inside. Graham turned to Wade. "I'll round up a few more men. We'll be there by nightfall." Wade felt something ease in his chest, just slightly. "I appreciate it." "Don't thank me yet. We don't know what we're riding into." "No, but it helps knowing I won't be facing it alone." Graham clapped him on the shoulder. "That's what neighbors are for." Wade rode back to his ranch as the sun angled west. When he arrived, he found Eli and Mara waiting on the porch. Eli stood when Wade dismounted. "Everything all right?" Eli asked. "Will be. Got some help coming." "What kind of help?" "The kind with rifles." Relief flickered across Eli's face, quickly followed by guilt. "You shouldn't have to do this. Any of this." "Already told you, it's not up for discussion." "But, Eli," Wade's voice was firm but not unkind. "You asked me a question. I gave you my word. That means something to me. Maybe it doesn't mean much in Stillwater, but out here a man's word is all he's got. I don't break mine." Eli looked down, his throat working. "Thank you." Wade nodded, moved past him into the house. Mara followed, her small hand slipping into his for just a moment before she let go. It was such a brief gesture that Wade almost missed it, but the warmth of it stayed with him long after. As evening fell, riders appeared on the horizon. Graham arrived first with his son Lucas, followed by 3 more men, ranchers Wade knew by name and reputation. They were hard men, lean and capable, the kind who'd fought drought and winter and didn't scare easy. They gathered in Wade's yard, horses stamping, leather creaking. Graham made introductions. "You know Tom Brennan and his brother Jack? And that's Henry Coulter." Wade nodded to each of them. "Appreciate you coming." Tom Brennan, a wiry man with gray streaking his beard, spat tobacco into the dirt. "Heard about Hackett. Heard he's got a reputation for pushing folks around. Don't much care for bullies." "How many you figure he'll bring?" Jack Brennan asked. He was younger than his brother, maybe 30, with quick eyes and a cavalry saber scar on his forearm. 8 yesterday, Wade said. "Could be more tonight." "We'll be ready," Henry Coulter said. He was the youngest of the group, barely 25, but steady. "Where you want us?" Wade laid out positions. Henry and Lucas in the barn with good sightlines on the road, Tom and Jack behind the water trough with cover and crossfire, Graham with Wade on the porch. It wasn't a fort, but it was defensible. "They come peaceful, we let them leave peaceful," Wade said. "But if they draw, we finish it." The men nodded, checked their weapons, and took their positions. The sun dropped below the horizon, and darkness settled over the grassland like a blanket. Inside the house, Eli helped Mara down into the cellar. Wade watched from the kitchen, saw the way Eli knelt beside his sister, speaking quietly to her. "It's going to be loud," Eli was saying. But you stay down here and you stay quiet, all right? No matter what you hear. Mara nodded, her face solemn. I'm going to be right upstairs. Wade's going to keep us safe. You believe me? Yes. Eli hugged her, held on for a long moment, then pulled back. Good girl. He climbed out and Wade lowered the trapdoor, covered it with a rug. Eli stood there, staring at the spot where his sister was hidden, his hands shaking. She'll be all right, Wade said. I know. Eli's voice was hollow. Doesn't make it easier. No, it doesn't. They went out onto the porch together. The night was cold and clear, stars scattered across the sky like spilled salt. Wade could see the dark shapes of the other men at their positions, waiting. Eli sat down in one of the chairs, the revolver Wade had given him heavy in his lap. What do we do now? We wait. And so they did. They came just after midnight. Wade heard them before he saw them, the low thunder of hooves, the jingle of harness. He stood, rifle ready, and the other men shifted at their positions. Eli rose from his chair, pale but steady. The riders appeared as shadows against the starlight, moving slow and deliberate. Wade counted them. 10, maybe 12. More than yesterday. They stopped just beyond the fence line. Boone rode forward alone, his face a pale blur in the darkness. Last chance, Hollis, Boone called. Hand over the boy and we leave. No one has to die tonight. Wade's voice cut through the darkness, cold and final. Turn around. This is your last chance, not mine. Boone sat his horse for a long moment. Then he laughed, low and ugly. All right, then. He wheeled his horse and rode back to the others. Wade heard voices, saw movement, and then, with a shout, they charged. The night exploded into violence. Gunfire lit up the darkness, muzzle flashes strobing like lightning. Wade fired, worked the lever, fired again. Beside him, Graham's rifle cracked steady and methodical. From the barn, Henry and Lucas opened up, their shots driving riders toward the water trough where Tom and Jack waited. Men screamed, horses shrieked and bolted, the air filled with smoke and noise and chaos. Wade saw a rider go down, saw another clutch his shoulder and wheel away. He tracked Boone through the confusion, saw the man dismount and take cover behind a wagon 30 yards out. Graham, cover me, Wade said, and vaulted off the porch. He moved fast and low, using the darkness and smoke for cover. A bullet whined past his ear, close enough to feel the heat. He dropped behind a water barrel, fired twice at a shape moving near the barn, and kept going. Boone saw him coming and rose from behind the wagon, pistol raised. They fired at the same instant. Wade felt the bullet tear through his coat, hot and close. His own shot caught Boone in the leg, and the man went down with a curse. Wade closed the distance, kicked Boone's pistol away, and leveled the rifle at his head. Call them off. Boone glared up at him, blood streaming from his leg. Go to hell. Call them off or I put a bullet in your skull. Behind them, the gunfire was tapering off. Wade heard Graham shouting, heard men cursing and horses fleeing. The fight was breaking apart, Hackett's men scattering into the darkness. Boone saw it too. His jaw clenched, fury and pain warring in his face. You're a dead man, Hollis. Hackett will... Wade pressed the rifle barrel against Boone's forehead. He'll what? Boone went silent. You tell Hackett this, Wade said, his voice low and hard. He sends men onto my land again. I'll kill every one of them. And then I'll ride to Stillwater and I'll burn his whole goddamn empire to the ground. You understand me? Boone stared up at him, and for the first time Wade saw fear flicker in those cold eyes. I understand. Good. Now get the hell off my property. Wade stepped back. Boone dragged himself to his feet, limping badly, and stumbled toward where one of the riderless horses stood trembling. He hauled himself into the saddle and rode off into the night. Wade turned back toward the house. The yard was a mess. Broken wood, blood, spent brass glinting in the starlight. Graham and the others were emerging from their positions, checking for injuries. Anyone hurt? Wade called. Lucas took a graze, Graham said. But he'll live. You? Wade looked down at the tear in his coat, felt the burn where the bullet had passed close. I'm fine. Tom Brennan kicked at one of the bodies sprawled near the fence. 2 dead. 3, maybe 4 wounded. Rest scattered. Let them scatter, Wade said, long as they don't come back. He walked to the porch where Eli stood frozen, the revolver unfired in his shaking hands. The boy looked shell-shocked, his eyes wide and fixed on the carnage in the yard. It's over, Wade said gently. You did good. Eli's gaze snapped to him. I didn't do anything. I froze. You stayed where I told you. That's what mattered. But I should have. You kept yourself alive. That's enough. Wade moved past him into the house and knelt beside the trap door. He pulled back the rug, lifted the door. Mara, it's Wade. It's safe now. For a moment, nothing. Then a small face appeared in the darkness below, pale and frightened. Wade reached down and lifted her out, set her on her feet. She looked around at the men filing into the house, at the blood on Wade's hands, and her eyes filled with tears. Is Eli? Right here, Eli said, coming through the door. He crossed to her and pulled her into his arms, held her tight. I'm here. We're okay. Mara buried her face against his chest, and finally, she cried, great heaving sobs that shook her small frame. Eli held her and whispered reassurances, and Wade turned away to give them privacy. Graham came up beside him. You all right? Wade nodded. Thanks for coming. Told you, that's what neighbors do. Graham paused, looked out at the yard. You think this is the end of it? I don't know. Maybe. If Boone delivers my message and Hackett's smart, it will be. And if he's not smart? Wade's jaw tightened. Then we'll be ready. The men stayed through the night, keeping watch, but no one else came. By dawn, they'd buried the dead in a shallow grave beyond the fence line and cleaned up the worst of the damage. Graham and the others mounted up to leave, and Wade walked them out. You need anything? You send word, Graham said. I will. And Wade? Graham looked back at the house, where Eli and Mara stood on the porch watching. You did right by those kids. Don't forget that. Wade nodded, and Graham rode off with the others, leaving Wade alone in the quiet aftermath. He turned back to the house, to the two children who'd turned his carefully ordered solitude into something messy and complicated and achingly alive. Eli met his eyes, and Wade saw the question there, the same question the boy had asked on that first night. Who'll feed my sister? Wade had answered it then with a promise. And last night, he'd proven it with blood. Now he just had to figure out what came next. The days that followed the gunfight settled into an uneasy peace. Wade repaired the damage to the porch, bullet holes in the planks, a shattered window that he boarded over until he could get glass from town. He worked methodically, letting the familiar rhythm of hammer and nails quiet the tension that still coiled tight in his chest. Eli insisted on helping despite his lingering weakness, and Wade let him, understanding that the boy needed something to do with his hands, something to prove he wasn't useless. Mara stayed close to both of them, her earlier silence replaced by a watchfulness that felt different now. She talked more. Small observations and questions that Wade answered with more patience than he'd known he possessed. She asked about the horses, about how to tell when a storm was coming, about why the cottonwoods grew only near water. Wade found himself explaining things he'd never bothered to put into words before, and the sound of her voice in the quiet house became something he looked forward to rather than something that unsettled him. On the third day after the fight, Wade rode into town for supplies. The settlement of Copper Ridge was small, a general store, a blacksmith, a church, and a saloon that doubled as the social center for ranchers and drifters alike. Wade tied his horse outside the store and went in, nodding to Martha Hendricks behind the counter. Wade, she said, her voice carefully neutral. Martha was in her 60s, sharp-eyed and sharp-tongued, and she'd known Wade since he'd first settled in the valley. Heard you had some trouble out your way. News traveled fast in ranch country. Wade wasn't surprised. Nothing I couldn't handle. Graham Bridger says you faced down a dozen armed men over a couple of kids. Graham talks too much. Martha's mouth twitched, almost a smile. Maybe, but he also says those kids needed someone to stand for them, and you did. That counts for something. Wade didn't answer, just pulled out his list and set it on the counter. Martha read it over, gathering items: flour, sugar, coffee, ammunition, fabric for Mara's dress that had more holes than cloth. While she worked, Wade became aware of eyes on him from the other side of the store. He turned and saw Samuel Garrett, a rancher from the east side of the valley, watching him with an expression Wade couldn't quite read. Samuel approached, a stocky man with a weathered face and cautious eyes. "Wade, got a minute?" "Depends what you need." "Just to talk." Samuel glanced around, lowered his voice. "That business with Hackett's men. Word is they came for a boy who worked for Hackett in Stillwater." "That's right." "And you sent them packing." "I did." Samuel shifted his weight, uncomfortable. "Thing is, Wade, some folks are nervous. Hackett's got a long reach, and if he decides to make an example out of you, it could spill over, affect the whole valley." Wade felt his jaw tighten. "You saying I should have handed the kids over?" "I'm saying maybe this wasn't your fight to pick. It became my fight the moment they stepped onto my land asking for help." "But at what cost?" Samuel's voice dropped further. "You've got no family, no one depending on you. These kids aren't yours. Why risk everything for strangers?" The question hit harder than Samuel probably intended. Wade looked at the man for a long moment, seeing the fear beneath the words, the same fear that made people turn away from trouble rather than face it. "Because someone had to," Wade said quietly. "And because when a dying boy asks you to keep his sister alive, you don't get to say no and still call yourself a man." Samuel's face reddened. "I didn't mean, I know what you meant. And I'm telling you, it doesn't matter if they're mine by blood or not. They're under my roof, under my protection. That makes them mine in the ways that count." Samuel opened his mouth, closed it, and finally nodded stiffly. "Just wanted you to know some folks are worried, is all." "Folks can worry all they want, won't change anything." Samuel walked away, and Wade turned back to find Martha watching him with something like approval in her eyes. "That boy still sick?" she asked. "She getting stronger every day." "And the girl?" "She's 7. Scared, but she's tougher than she looks." Martha wrapped his supplies in brown paper, tied them with string. "You planning to keep them?" The question caught Wade off guard. He hadn't let himself think that far ahead, hadn't allowed himself to consider what came after the immediate crisis was over. "I don't know. Haven't asked them what they want. Might want to, before you get too attached." Wade paid for the supplies and carried them out to his horse. The ride back to the ranch gave him time to think, and Martha's question echoed in his mind like a bell that wouldn't stop ringing. What happened next? Eli was getting well, his strength returning day by day. Soon he'd be healthy enough to leave, to take Mara somewhere else, somewhere safer. The thought should have brought relief. Wade's life could go back to the quiet solitude he'd built so carefully. But instead, it sat heavy in his chest like a stone. When he arrived home, he found Eli in the barn mucking stalls while Mara sat on a hay bale watching, the wooden horse clutched in her hands. Eli looked up when Wade entered, his face flushed from exertion. "Thought I told you to take it easy," Wade said. "I'm fine, can't just sit around doing nothing." Wade set down the supplies and studied the boy. Eli's color was better, the fever flush gone, replaced by the natural ruddy health of someone who'd spent his life working outdoors. He'd put on a little weight, filled out in the shoulders and arms. He looked less like a dying boy and more like a young man coming into his strength. "We need to talk," Wade said. Eli's expression shuddered, like he'd been expecting this. "All right." They walked outside, leaving Mara in the barn. The afternoon sun was warm despite the autumn chill, and the grassland stretched golden and endless toward the horizon. Wade leaned against the fence, chose his words carefully. "You're getting well," he said. "Strong enough to travel soon, if that's what you want." Eli was quiet for a moment. "Is that what you want? For us to leave?" "I'm asking what you want." "I want—" Eli stopped, swallowed. "I don't know. I didn't think past getting Mara somewhere safe, didn't think I'd live long enough to have to figure out what comes next." "Well, you did live, so now you have to figure it out." Eli looked at him, something raw and uncertain in his eyes. "Can I ask you something?" "Go ahead." "Why'd you do it, really? Samuel Garrett came by yesterday while you were working the north fence. He said you risked your life for strangers, that you had no reason to care if we lived or died. So why did you?" Wade was silent for a long time, watching the wind move through the grass. Finally he said, "I had a son once, and a wife, 10 years ago." Eli went very still. Boy was about Mara's age when he got sick, Wade continued, his voice flat and distant. Scarlet fever spread through the valley that winter. Took a dozen kids before it burned itself out. My wife, Sarah, she nursed him day and night. I was out trying to save cattle from a blizzard. Thought I could do both, save the herd and get back in time. I was wrong. The words came hard, sharp-edged and bitter. By the time I got home, they were both gone. Sarah had caught it from the boy, and neither of them had the strength left to fight. They died while I was trying to save animals that ended up freezing anyway. Eli's face had gone pale. I'm sorry. I buried them out past the cottonwoods, closed up their room, and didn't open it again until the night you showed up. Wade turned to look at Eli directly. So when you asked me who'd feed your sister if you died, I heard my son asking me to save him, and I couldn't do it then, but I could do it now. That's why. Eli's throat worked, and when he spoke, his voice was rough. I don't know what to say. Don't have to say anything. Just needed you to understand it wasn't about you being worth saving or not. It was about me getting a second chance to do what I couldn't do before. Did it work? Did you get your second chance? Wade considered that, thought about Mara's laughter when she'd discovered the chickens that morning, about Eli's determination to help despite his weakness, about the way the house felt less like a tomb and more like a home. Maybe, he said, or maybe I'm just trying to outrun ghosts. Either way, you and Mara get to choose what happens next. You want to stay. You can stay. You want to move on. I'll help you get wherever you need to go. But it's your choice. Eli looked down at his hands, scarred and calloused from years of hard work. If we stay, what would that look like? You'd work the ranch? Learn the land. I'd teach you what I know. Mara'd go to school when it starts up again in spring. You'd earn your keep, but you'd also have a roof over your head and food on the table. No debt, no owing anyone anything except honest work for honest shelter. And if Hackett comes back? Then we deal with it, same as before. Eli was quiet for a long moment, and Wade could see him turning it over in his mind, weighing the safety of staying against the risk, measuring what it would cost him to accept help against what it would cost to refuse it. I need to talk to Mara, Eli said finally. She should have a say in this too. Fair enough. They walked back to the barn together. Mara looked up when they entered, her eyes moving between them, reading the seriousness in their faces. What's wrong? She asked. Eli crouched down in front of her. Nothing's wrong, but Wade and I need to talk to you about something important. Okay? We have a choice to make. We can stay here, work the ranch, make this our home. Or we can leave, go somewhere else, start over in a new place. Mara's eyes widened. We can stay? If that's what you want? What do you want, Eli? Eli glanced up at Wade, then back to his sister. I want you to be safe and happy. And I think maybe we could be both of those things here. Mara looked at Wade, her small face solemn. Do you want us to stay? The question was so simple, so direct, that it cut straight through all of Wade's carefully constructed walls. He crouched down beside Eli so he was at her eye level. Yeah, he said, and his voice came out rougher than he intended. I do. Mara smiled then, wide and bright, and threw her arms around Wade's neck. The gesture caught him completely off guard, and for a moment he didn't know what to do with his hands. Then, slowly, carefully, he put his arms around her small frame and held on. Over her head, he met Eli's eyes and saw the same relief, the same cautious hope that Wade felt settling into his own chest like something fragile and new. Then we'll stay, Mara said, pulling back. If that's all right? It's all right, Wade said. More than all right. That night at dinner, the three of them sat at the table, and for the first time it didn't feel like an arrangement of convenience. It felt like family, or at least the beginning of one. Wade watched Eli help Mara cut her meat, watched the easy way they moved around each other, the small intimacies of people who'd survived hell together and come out the other side. And he felt something in himself begin to thaw, some frozen part that he'd thought was dead forever. After dinner, Mara fell asleep in the chair by the fire, exhausted from the day's emotions. Eli carried her to bed and came back to find Wade standing at the window, looking out at the darkness. Thank you, Eli said quietly. Wade turned. For what? For giving us a chance. For not turning us away when you could have. You gave me a chance too, Wade said. To be something other than a man waiting to die. Figured that was worth taking. Eli moved to stand beside him at the window. What happens if Hackett doesn't give up? If he sends more men? Then we fight again. And we keep fighting until he realizes we're more trouble than we're worth. You really think he'll stop? I think men like Hackett only understand one thing: strength. We showed him we have it. Now we just have to make sure he believes it. They stood in silence for a while, watching the stars wheel overhead. Finally, Eli said, I'm not good at this. Trusting people. Letting someone help. My whole life it's been just me and Mara against the world. I'm not good at it either. Haven't had anyone to trust in a long time. Guess we'll have to figure it out together then. Wade nodded. Guess so. The next morning brought rain, cold and steady, turning the grassland gray and washing away the last traces of blood from the yard. Wade worked inside, teaching Eli how to repair tack and mend harness, while Mara sat at the table practicing her letters on a slate Wade had found in town. She'd had some schooling in Stillwater, but it was scattered and incomplete, and she attacked the work with fierce concentration, determined to catch up. Around midday, they heard hoofbeats outside. Wade moved to the window, hand instinctively going to the rifle. But it was just Graham Bridger riding in alone, his hat pulled low against the rain. Wade opened the door and Graham dismounted, water streaming off his oilskin coat. Got news, he said without preamble. Thought you should hear it. They went inside and Graham accepted the coffee Eli poured, warming his hands around the cup. Hackett's men pulled out of Stillwater 3 days ago, Graham said. All of them. Packed up and left town. Wade felt something sharp and alert come alive in his chest. Why? Seems word got around about what happened here. About how you and the neighbors sent his boys running. Folks in Stillwater started asking questions. Why Hackett was sending armed men after a sick boy and his kid sister. Some of the businessmen got nervous, worried it'd bring trouble they didn't need. So they ran him out? Not exactly, but they made it clear his protection wasn't worth what it was costing. Hackett's smart enough to know when the ground's shifting under him. He took his operation east toward Billings, left Stillwater to sort itself out. Eli had gone very still, the color draining from his face. He's really gone? Gone enough that you don't have to look over your shoulder anymore. Mara looked up from her slate, her eyes wide. We're safe? Graham smiled at her, the expression softening his weathered face. Yeah, little one. You're safe. The relief that flooded through the room was almost palpable. Eli sat down hard in a chair, like his legs wouldn't hold him anymore, and Mara abandoned her slate to climb into his lap. Wade felt his own shoulders drop, tension he'd been carrying for weeks finally releasing. There's more, Graham said, looking at Wade. Tom Brennan's been talking to folks around the valley. About what you did, standing up to Hackett. About how you risked everything for a couple of kids who weren't yours. I didn't do it for recognition. I know, but it matters to people. Shows them there's still folks willing to do what's right, even when it's hard. Samuel Garrett came by my place yesterday, said he was wrong to question you. Said if more men had your backbone, the valley would be a better place. Wade snorted. Samuel say that, or are you making it sound prettier than it was? Graham grinned. Maybe a bit of both. Point is, you've got friends out here. More than you probably realize. You need anything, you just say the word. Appreciate it. Graham drained his coffee and stood. I'll let you folks get back to it. Just wanted you to know Hackett's not a problem anymore. Wade walked him out to his horse. The rain had led up to a drizzle, the clouds starting to break apart in the west. Graham swung into the saddle, looked down at Wade. Those kids are lucky to have you, he said. I'm the lucky one. Graham nodded like he understood, then rode off into the clearing weather. Wade stood in the yard for a long time, letting the rain wash over him, feeling something like peace settle into his bones for the first time in 10 years. When he went back inside, he found Eli and Mara at the window watching the clouds break apart, sunlight spilling through in golden shafts. It's over, Eli said, not quite a question. It's over. Mara turned to Wade, her face bright. Does that mean we can stay forever? Wade crouched down in front of her. Forever's a long time, but yeah, You can stay as long as you want. This is your home now if you'll have it. I'll have it, Mara said solemnly. Then she smiled, and it transformed her whole face. Thank you, Wade. Eli stood, extended his hand. Wade took it, and they shook. Two men sealing an agreement that went deeper than words. I'll work hard, Eli said. Earn my keep. Won't give you reason to regret this. I know you will, and for what it's worth, I don't regret it. Not any of it. The weeks that followed brought a rhythm to their days that felt almost normal. Eli's strength returned fully, and he threw himself into ranch work with a determination that impressed Wade. The boy learned fast, soaking up everything Wade taught him about handling horses, mending fence, reading weather. He made mistakes, but he learned from them, and he never complained about the long hours or hard work. Mara blossomed in the safety of the ranch. Her silence gave way to chatter, her wariness to curiosity. She helped in the kitchen, fed the chickens, and convinced Wade to let her try riding the gentlest of his horses. She fell off twice before she got the hang of it, and both times she got back on with stubborn determination that reminded Wade painfully of his son. The house changed too. Wade opened the upstairs rooms, aired them out, moved Eli and Mara into proper bedrooms instead of the small room on the first floor. He found himself cooking bigger meals, setting 3 places at the table without thinking about it. The silence that had once been his refuge became something he barely noticed, replaced by the sound of Mara singing while she worked and Eli's questions about livestock and land management. One evening in early November, Wade was teaching Eli to play chess when Mara came downstairs in her nightgown, carrying the wooden horse. Can't sleep? Wade asked. She shook her head, climbed into the chair beside him. I keep thinking about Stillwater, about how scared I was. Wade set down the chess piece he'd been holding. That's natural, takes time for the fear to fade. Does it ever really go away? Wade thought about Sarah and his son, about the guilt and grief that still woke him some nights. Not completely, but it gets quieter, and you learn to live around it. Were you scared when those men came? Yeah, I was scared. Mara looked surprised. But you didn't act scared. Being scared doesn't mean you can't be brave. Sometimes being brave is just doing what needs doing, even when you're terrified. She considered that, turning the wooden horse over in her small hands. I'm glad we found you. Me too. Eli looked up from the chessboard, his eyes meeting Wade's across the table. And that look was understanding, gratitude, and something deeper, the recognition that they'd all saved each other in ways that went beyond the physical. Your move, Eli said, nodding at the board. Wade smiled, moved his knight, and the evening settled around them like a warm blanket. The first snow came in mid-November, soft and silent in the night. Wade woke to a world transformed, everything covered in white, the landscape simplified to clean lines and gentle curves. He made coffee and stood on the porch watching the sun rise over the transformed grassland, painting the snow pink and gold. Behind him, the door opened and Eli stepped out, wrapped in a coat too big for him. Beautiful, isn't it? Eli said. Yeah. They stood in companionable silence, drinking coffee and watching the day begin. Finally, Eli said, I've been thinking about what you said, about second chances. Yeah? I think maybe we all got one. You, me, Mara. We all got a chance to be something different than what we were. Wade nodded slowly. Maybe that's what family is. People choosing to save each other over and over until it sticks. Is that what we are now? Family? Wade thought about the question, about what it meant to claim these children as his own, to let himself care about whether they lived or died, succeeded or failed, stayed or left. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. Yeah, he said finally, I think maybe we are. Eli's smile was small but genuine. Good, because I was hoping you'd say that. Inside, they heard Mara squeal with delight as she looked out the window at the snow. They went in to find her already dressed, bouncing with excitement. Can we go outside, please? Wade looked at Eli, who shrugged with a grin. Don't see why not. They spent the morning in the snow, building a snowman, having a snowball fight that left all 3 of them soaked and laughing. Wade couldn't remember the last time he'd laughed like that, freely and without reservation. It felt strange and wonderful and almost painful in its intensity. Later, when Mara had gone inside to warm up and Eli was tending the horses, Wade stood alone in the barn and let himself feel the full weight of what he'd taken on. Two children, depending on him, trusting him, looking to him for guidance and protection. It scared him more than facing Hackett's men had, because bullets he understood. This messy, complicated business of caring for people was territory he'd thought he'd left behind forever. But as he heard Mara's laughter drift out from the house and saw Eli working with quiet competence in the stalls, Wade realized he wouldn't trade this fear for all the peaceful solitude in the world. He'd been alone for 10 years, and it had nearly killed something essential in him. These children had brought that something back to life, and whatever came next, he'd face it with them by his side. The snow kept falling, soft and steady, covering the land in white. And inside the house that had been silent for so long, there was warmth and light, and the sound of voices raised in conversation. It wasn't the life Wade had planned, but it was the life he'd been given, and for the first time in a decade, that was enough. Winter settled over the Montana grassland like a benediction, cold and clean and unforgiving. The snow that had seemed so magical that first morning became a constant presence, piling in drifts against the barn, turning the world into an endless expanse of white broken only by the dark line of cottonwoods and the smoke rising from the chimney. Wade had lived through 20 Montana winters, but this one felt different. The house that had once been a place to escape the cold was now full of life. Mara's drawings tacked to the walls, Eli's boots by the door, the smell of bread baking and coffee always hot on the stove. They fell into routines that made the days predictable in ways Wade found both comforting and strange. Mornings started before dawn with Wade and Eli tending the animals while Mara made breakfast. Eli had proven himself capable with the horses and cattle, moving through the work with increasing confidence. Wade watched him grow stronger week by week, filling out in the chest and shoulders, his hands developing the same calluses Wade's carried. The boy never complained about the cold or the early hours, never balked at the hard work. He seemed to understand that he was earning something more valuable than wages. He was earning his place. Mara attacked her schoolwork with the same fierce determination she brought to everything else. Wade had ordered primers and readers from the catalog, and she worked through them methodically, her small face scrunched in concentration. On days when the snow was too heavy for outdoor work, Wade found himself teaching both children things he'd learned over a lifetime: how to read the sky for weather, how to judge the health of livestock, how to track game through fresh snow. Eli absorbed it all with quiet focus, but Mara asked endless questions, her curiosity bottomless and exhausting, and somehow wonderful. One morning in late November, Wade was in the barn repairing a broken wagon wheel when he heard voices outside. He set down his tools and stepped out to find a wagon pulling into the yard, driven by a woman he didn't recognize. She was perhaps 35, bundled against the cold in a heavy coat and scarf, with sharp eyes that took in everything about the ranch in a single sweeping glance. She pulled the wagon to a stop and climbed down with practiced ease. "You Wade Hollis?" "I am." "I'm Catherine Pierce. I teach at the school in Copper Ridge." She gestured toward the house. "Heard you've got a girl of school age living with you now." Wade felt something defensive rise in his chest. "That's right. Mara. She's 7. School started back up 2 weeks ago. I've been expecting her." "Been teaching her myself. She's learning just fine." Catherine's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes softened slightly. "I'm sure she is, but there are things she needs that go beyond reading and arithmetic. She needs to be around other children, needs to learn how to be part of a community." Wade hadn't thought about that. In his mind, keeping Mara safe meant keeping her close, where he could see her, where nothing could reach her. The idea of sending her off to town every day, of letting her out of his sight, made his chest tight. "She's been through a lot," he said carefully. "Might not be ready for that yet." "Mr. Hollis, I've been teaching for 15 years. I've seen children who've been through every kind of hardship you can imagine. What they need most is normalcy, structure, a chance to be children instead of survivors." The words hit harder than Wade expected. He looked toward the house, where he could see Mara's face pressed against the window, watching. "How far is the school?" he asked. 5 miles. I know that's a long ride for a child in winter, but there are other families who live farther out." We make arrangements. Some children board in town during the week, go home on weekends. Wade's jaw tightened. She's not boarding anywhere. If she goes to school, she comes home every night. Catherine studied him for a moment, and Wade saw understanding dawn in her expression. All right. Then perhaps you and the boy could bring her in the mornings, pick her up in the afternoons. Or we could arrange for her to ride with the Brennan children. They pass within a mile of your place. Wade considered that, weighing his protective instincts against Catherine's words about normalcy and community. Finally, he said, "Let me talk to her, see what she wants." Fair enough? Catherine climbed back onto her wagon. School starts at 8, finishes at 3. If she's coming, have her there Monday morning. She drove off, and Wade stood in the yard watching her go until Eli came out of the barn, hay still clinging to his coat. "What was that about?" Eli asked. "School teacher. Wants Mara to attend classes in town." Eli's expression shifted, something complicated moving across his face. "That's good, right? She should be in school." "You worried about her being away from the ranch?" "Little bit. But Miss Pierce is right. Mara needs to be around other kids, needs to have a life that isn't just work and worry." Eli paused, then added quietly, "It's what our ma would have wanted." Wade nodded slowly, feeling the weight of responsibility settle heavier on his shoulders. He went inside and found Mara at the table, her primer open but her attention fixed on the door. "Who was that lady?" she asked. Wade sat down across from her. "Her name's Miss Pierce. She teaches at the school in Copper Ridge." Mara's eyes went wide. "Am I in trouble?" "No, she just wanted to know if you'd like to come to school." "Really?" Wade saw the hope flash across her face, quick and bright, before uncertainty clouded it. "I don't know if I'd be good enough. The other kids have probably been going all along. Miss Pierce says you'd catch up quick, and I think you would too. You're smart, Mara, smarter than you give yourself credit for." "Would I have to go every day?" "Every day school's in session, yeah." Mara bit her lip, working through the implications. "Would I still live here? With you and Eli?" The question made Wade's throat tight. "Of course. This is your home. School's just something you do during the day, like chores. You'd come home every night." "What if the other kids don't like me?" Wade reached across the table and took her small hand in his scarred, work-roughened one. "Then they're fools. But I think they will like you. And even if some don't, you'll find the ones who do. That's how it works." Mara looked down at their joined hands, then back up at his face. "Do you think I should go?" Wade thought about Sarah, about the plans they'd made for their son's education, about all the dreams that had died with them. "Yeah," he said. "I think you should. I think it'll be good for you." "Okay, then I'll go." That night at dinner, they discussed the logistics. Eli volunteered to ride with Mara to and from school each day until she felt comfortable making the trip with the Brennan children. Wade agreed, relieved to know she wouldn't be alone on the road. They spent the weekend preparing. Wade rode into town and bought Mara a proper school dress and warm coat, books, and a slate. Mara practiced her penmanship until her fingers ached, nervous and excited in equal measure. Monday morning came cold and clear. Mara was up before dawn, dressed and ready, too anxious to eat more than a few bites of breakfast. Wade saddled 2 horses and helped her mount, adjusting her stirrups and making sure her coat was buttoned tight against the wind. "You'll do fine," he said. "What if I forget everything? What if I can't answer the questions?" "Then you'll learn. That's what school's for." Eli swung into his saddle, his expression protective. "I'll be right outside if you need me. Just ask Miss Pierce and I'll come in." Mara nodded, trying to look brave. Wade watched them ride out together, 2 small figures against the vast white landscape, and felt a peculiar ache in his chest. It was the first time since they'd arrived that Mara would be beyond his immediate reach, beyond his ability to protect her. The feeling was uncomfortable and necessary all at once. The day crawled by. Wade threw himself into work, repairing fence and chopping wood, but his mind kept drifting to Mara sitting in a classroom full of strangers, trying to prove she belonged. When he finally heard hoofbeats in the late afternoon, he dropped the axe and walked to the yard faster than he'd intended. Mara was talking animatedly to Eli as they rode in, her earlier nervousness replaced by excitement. She slid down from her horse and ran to Wade, her face flushed from the cold and from happiness. How was it? Wade asked. It was wonderful. Miss Pierce is so smart, and there's a girl named Annie who sits next to me, and she let me borrow her colored pencils, and we learned about state capitals, and Miss Pierce said my penmanship was excellent. The words tumbled out in a rush, and Wade found himself smiling despite his earlier worry. Sounds like you had a good day. The best day. Can I go back tomorrow? Every day, remember? Good. Over dinner, Mara told them everything. About the other children, about the lessons, about the library corner with more books than she'd ever seen in one place. Eli listened with quiet contentment, and Wade realized that sending Mara to school had lifted a burden from the boy's shoulders. Eli had carried the weight of his sister's welfare for years, and now he could share it, could trust that other people would look out for her too. The weeks slipped past in a blur of routine and small revelations. Mara thrived at school, making friends, and bringing home assignments that she attacked with passionate focus. Eli continued to grow into his role on the ranch, taking on more responsibility until Wade found himself relying on the boy's judgment as much as his labor. They worked side by side through the short winter days, their conversations ranging from practical matters to deeper things. What Eli wanted from his life. What kind of man he hoped to become. One evening in mid-December, Wade was showing Eli how to work leather when the boy said, "Can I ask you something personal?" Wade looked up from the saddle he was repairing. "Go ahead." "Do you ever think about getting married again, having a family the usual way?" The question caught Wade off guard. He set down his tools, considered how to answer. "Used to think about it. Right after Sarah died, I told myself I'd find someone eventually, start over. But the years passed, and I never did. Got comfortable being alone." "Are you still comfortable with it?" Wade looked at him, this boy who'd stumbled onto his porch half dead and desperate, who'd become something like a son without either of them quite deciding it. "No," he said honestly. "Not anymore. But I'm not looking for a wife, if that's what you're asking. What we've got here, it's enough." Eli nodded slowly. "Good, because I think Mara and I need you more than we'd need a new mother. No offense to whoever she might have been." "None taken." They worked in comfortable silence for a while, the only sounds the rasp of leather and the crackle of the fire. Finally, Wade said, "What about you? You think about what you want? After you're grown, I mean." "Sometimes. I think maybe I'd like to have land of my own someday. A place like this, where I could build something that'd last." "You could have that. You're young yet, but you work hard. Save your money, learn the business. In a few years, you could buy your own section, start your own herd." Eli looked up, surprise evident in his face. "You'd help me do that?" "Why wouldn't I? I thought maybe you'd want me to stay here, work this place." Wade set down the awl he'd been using and met Eli's eyes directly. "This ranch will be yours someday, if you want it. But that's years off, and you've got time to figure out what you actually want rather than what you think you should want. You've spent your whole life taking care of other people, doing what you had to do to survive. Now you get to choose." Eli's throat worked, emotion flickering across his face. "You'd really leave me the ranch? Your family, that's what family does." "I don't know what to say." "Don't have to say anything, just something to think about." That conversation marked a shift between them. Eli carried himself differently after that, with a confidence that came from knowing his future held possibility instead of just survival. Wade watched him blossom into someone capable and thoughtful, someone any father would be proud to call son. Christmas came quiet and simple. Wade had never celebrated much after Sarah died, but Mara's excitement was infectious. She made decorations from pine boughs and ribbon, and Eli cut down a small tree that they set up in the main room. Wade carved Mara a set of wooden animals to go with her horse, and made Eli a proper hunting knife with a bone handle. They were small gifts, practical, but the children received them with such genuine joy that Wade felt something warm and almost painful expand in his chest. On Christmas morning, after they'd opened their presents and eaten a breakfast of sourdough pancakes and bacon, Mara climbed into Wade's lap, something she did rarely now that she was getting older, and said, "This is the best Christmas I ever had." Wade thought about all the Christmases he'd spent alone, the years of silence and solitude and grief, and realized she was right. This was the best Christmas he'd ever had, too. The new year brought harder weather, January was brutal, with temperatures dropping so low that water froze in the barn and the cattle needed extra feed just to stay alive. Wade and Eli worked from before dawn until after dark, breaking ice, hauling hay, checking the herd for signs of sickness or injury. It was exhausting, relentless work, but they did it together, and that made all the difference. One night in late January, a blizzard roared in with almost no warning. Wade and Eli were out checking the cattle when the wind shifted and the temperature plummeted. Within minutes, visibility dropped to nothing, the world reduced to howling white chaos. "We need to get back," Wade shouted over the wind. They turned their horses toward home, but the landmarks Wade knew by heart had disappeared. The landscape was featureless, disorienting. He tried to keep his bearings by the wind direction, but the storm was circling, confused and vicious. Eli pulled his horse close. "I can't see anything." "Stay with me. Don't get separated." They pushed on, the cold seeping through their coats despite the layers. Wade's face felt numb, his fingers stiff on the reins. He tried to calculate how far they'd come, how far they still had to go, but the wind and cold made thinking difficult. Time became meaningless. They might have been riding for 10 minutes or an hour when Eli's horse stumbled. The boy nearly went down with it, saved only by his grip on the saddle horn. "You all right?" Wade called. "Yeah, horse is limping though," Wade cursed. A lame horse in a blizzard was a death sentence. He dismounted, his legs nearly buckling when they hit the ground, and moved to check Eli's horse. The animal had stepped wrong, possibly into a prairie dog hole hidden by the snow. It could walk, but not far, and not fast. "You're riding with me," Wade said, helping Eli transfer to his horse. "Your mount will follow." They pressed on, 2 people on one horse, the injured animal trailing behind. Wade's internal compass told him they should be close to the ranch, but in the whiteout he couldn't be sure. If they missed the house by even 100 yards, they could ride right past it and die within sight of home. Then, through the screaming wind, Wade heard something. A bell, faint but persistent. He turned toward the sound, and there, materializing out of the snow like a miracle, was the dark shape of the barn. Mara must have gone out and hung the dinner bell, ringing it to guide them home. They made it to the barn and stumbled inside, both of them shaking with cold. Eli tended the horses while Wade moved to the house, where he found Mara standing on the porch, the bell rope still in her hands, her face pale with worry. "I heard the storm coming," she said, her voice small. "I thought you might need help finding your way." Wade pulled her inside, his hands clumsy with cold. "You did good. Real good." Eli came in a few minutes later, and they spent the evening huddled by the fire, drinking hot coffee and waiting for feeling to return to their frozen extremities. The blizzard raged outside, but inside they were warm and safe. And Wade realized that this moment of them together, alive because they'd looked out for each other, this was what family actually meant. The storm blew itself out by morning, leaving the world transformed. Snow had drifted against the north side of the house, nearly to the roof, and the landscape was sculpted into strange, beautiful shapes. They spent 2 days digging out, working until their backs ached and their hands were raw. When they finally got the road clear enough for travel, Wade rode into town for supplies and found the community gathered at the church, taking stock of who'd made it through and who was in trouble. 2 families on the far side of the valley had lost livestock, and old Henry Coulter's barn had collapsed under the weight of snow. Without being asked, Wade volunteered himself and Eli to help with repairs. Over the next week, they worked alongside their neighbors, rebuilding Henry's barn and helping move cattle to better shelter. It was hard, cold work, but there was a camaraderie to it that Wade hadn't felt in years. These people had stood with him against Hackett's men, and now he stood with them against the winter. It was how things worked in ranch country. You helped when help was needed, and you trusted that when your turn came, others would do the same. One evening, working late to finish the barn roof before another storm hit, Graham Bridger paused beside Wade and said, "You've changed." Wade looked up from the shingle he was nailing. "How so?" "Used to be you'd help with work like this, but you'd keep yourself separate, like you were doing a job, not being part of something. Now you're different, more present." Wade thought about that, about the wall he'd built around himself after Sarah died, about how Eli and Mara had torn it down piece by piece without him quite realizing it was happening. Had some things come into my life that reminded me why being part of something matters. Graham nodded toward where Eli was working alongside Tom Brennan, the two of them laughing about something. That boy's good for you. Both of them are. Yeah, they are. You thinking about making it official? Adopting them legal-like? The question surprised Wade. He hadn't thought about the legal side of things, hadn't considered that there might be paperwork and courts involved. In his mind, Eli and Mara were already his, as much his children as if they'd been born to him. But Graham had a point. Making it legal would give them all protections, would make sure no one could ever challenge their right to be together. Might be I should look into that, Wade said. Talk to Judge Morrison next time you're in town. He's fair, and he knows your situation. Shouldn't be too complicated, given the circumstances. Wade filed that information away, something to think about when the immediate crisis of winter had passed. For now, there was work to do and weather to survive, and those immediate concerns took precedence over paperwork and legalities. February brought a brief thaw, the temperature rising just enough to turn the world into a mess of mud and melting snow. Mara went back to school after being snowed in for 2 weeks, and she returned each day with stories about the Valentine's Day party they were planning and the spelling bee Miss Pierce had organized. Her enthusiasm was boundless, her integration into the community complete in ways Wade hadn't dared hope for. One afternoon, she came home with a drawing she'd made in class, a picture of the ranch house with 3 stick figures standing in front of it. She'd written names under each figure: Wade, Eli, Mara. Under the drawing, in her careful practice script, she'd written, "My family." Wade stood looking at that drawing for a long time, something fierce and protective rising in his chest. This was what he'd fought for, what he'd risked everything to protect. Not just their physical safety, but their right to be a family, to have a home where they belonged without question or condition. He tacked the drawing to the wall beside the stove, where he'd see it every morning while making coffee. Mara noticed and smiled, and that smile was worth more than all the empty years Wade had spent alone. As winter began to loosen its grip and the first hints of spring appeared in the lengthening days and the return of migrating birds, Wade felt something settle in him that he hadn't felt in a decade. It was peace, or something close to it. The kind of peace that came from knowing you were exactly where you were supposed to be, doing exactly what you were meant to do. One evening in early March, after Mara had gone to bed and Eli was reading by the fire, Wade sat at the table with a cup of coffee and thought about the question Eli had asked on the porch that first day. Who'll feed my sister? The answer had seemed so simple then. I will. But it had turned into something so much larger than feeding, so much more complex than simple shelter and safety. It had become about teaching and protecting and guiding, about showing 2 wounded children that the world could be kind, that people could be trusted, that they deserved love not because they'd earned it, but simply because they existed. Wade had thought he was saving them, but the truth was more complicated. They'd saved each other. Eli and Mara had given Wade a reason to live again, a purpose beyond just waiting for time to pass, and Wade had given them what they'd never had: stability, safety, and the knowledge that someone would fight for them no matter the cost. He looked at Mara's drawing on the wall, at Eli absorbed in his book, at the home they'd built together from desperation and hope and stubborn determination. This was his second chance, his redemption for the family he'd failed to save. And this time, he wouldn't fail. This time, he'd keep his promise, no matter what it took. Spring came to Montana in fits and starts, the land caught between winter's death grip and the promise of renewal. The snow melted in patches, revealing brown grass that would green up once the warmth truly settled in. Creeks swelled with runoff, and the air carried the scent of wet earth and new growth. Wade found himself watching the changes with a heightened awareness, seeing the land through Mara's wondering eyes as she discovered wildflowers pushing through the last remnants of snow, and listened to Eli's observations about which pastures would be best for grazing once the cattle could be moved. It was during this transitional time, on a bright April morning, when the world felt balanced between what had been and what would be, that Wade made the trip into Copper Ridge to see Judge Morrison. He'd thought about it through the long winter nights, turned it over in his mind until the decision felt inevitable rather than chosen. Eli and Mara were his children in every way that mattered, but Graham had been right. Making it legal would protect them all, would ensure that no distant relative or bureaucratic complication could ever tear them apart. Judge Morrison's office was above the general store, a cramped room that smelled of pipe tobacco and old paper. The judge himself was a lean man in his 60s with shrewd eyes and a reputation for fairness that extended across 3 counties. He listened without interrupting as Wade explained the situation, how Eli and Mara had arrived, what had happened with Hackett, how they'd become a family over the winter months. When Wade finished, Morrison leaned back in his chair, studying him over steepled fingers. You understand what you're asking for here? Legal adoption means full parental rights and full parental responsibilities. These children become yours in the eyes of the law, same as if Sarah had borne them. Wade met his gaze steadily. That's what I want. They've got no other living relatives? No one who might contest this? No one who'd want them or treat them right if they did. Morrison nodded slowly. I'll need statements from character witnesses, people who can attest to your fitness as a guardian and to the children's well-being under your care. I can get those. There'll be a home visit. I'll need to speak with the children separately, make sure they want this too. They're old enough to have a say. Eli is. At 16, his wishes carry weight. Mara's younger, but I'll talk to her anyway. Get a sense of how she feels about making this permanent. Morrison pulled out a form, began filling in details. I'll be honest with you, Wade. Given the circumstances and what I've heard about how you handled the Hackett situation, I don't anticipate any problems, but the process takes time. Could be 2 months, could be 6, depending on how fast the paperwork moves through the territorial offices. I can wait, long as I know it's happening. Morrison set down his pen and looked at Wade with something like approval. You're doing right by those kids? Sarah would be proud. The mention of his wife's name hit Wade unexpectedly. He nodded, not trusting his voice, and left the office with the forms Morrison had given him to fill out. On his way out of town, he stopped at the church where Reverend Matthews agreed to serve as a character witness, and at Graham Bridger's ranch where Graham not only agreed to provide a statement, but insisted on writing it immediately, his words blunt and honest, and filled with respect that made Wade's throat tight. When Wade returned home that evening, he found Eli and Mara in the kitchen attempting to make dinner. The results were chaotic, flour dusted across every surface, something burning in the oven. But they were laughing, working together with the ease of people who'd learned to trust each other completely. What's all this? Wade asked, setting down his saddlebags. Mara looked up, her face smudged with flour. We wanted to surprise you with dinner, but I think we surprised ourselves instead. Eli pulled a pan from the oven, revealing what might have once been biscuits but now resembled charcoal lumps. Cooking is harder than it looks. Wade felt something warm expand in his chest. Appreciate the thought. How about we work on it together, see if we can salvage something edible? They spent the next hour in the kitchen, Wade teaching them the tricks Sarah had taught him years ago. How to judge the oven temperature by feel, how to know when dough had been worked enough, the importance of timing. It was domestic and ordinary and perfect, and when they finally sat down to eat salvaged stew and acceptable second-attempt biscuits, Wade knew this was the right moment. I went to see Judge Morrison today, he said. Both children looked up, suddenly alert. Eli's expression was carefully neutral, but Wade could see the tension in his shoulders. What for? Mara asked. Wade chose his words carefully. I wanted to talk to him about making our arrangement official, about adopting both of you legal and proper, so there's no question that you're mine and I'm yours. The silence that followed was profound. Eli had gone very still, his fork suspended halfway to his mouth. Mara's eyes were wide, uncertain. You want to adopt us? Eli's voice was barely above a whisper. Yeah, I do, but only if that's what you want too. Judge Morrison will come talk to you both. Make sure you're choosing this free and clear. I won't force it on you if you'd rather things stayed as they are. Mara set down her fork, her small face serious. Would we have to change our names? Not if you don't want to. You can keep Mercer or take Hollis. That's up to you. Would we really be your children? Like, forever? Wade felt his throat constrict. Yeah, forever. No matter what happens, no matter where life takes any of us, you'd be mine and I'd be yours. That's what family means. Mara looked at Eli, some silent communication passing between them. Then Eli said, his voice rough with emotion, "We want that. We've wanted that since we got here. We just didn't dare hope you'd offer." "Then it's settled. Judge Morrison will come by in a few weeks to make it official." Mara got up from her chair and came around the table to wrap her arms around Wade's neck. He held her carefully, this child who'd been silent and terrified when she'd first arrived, and who now trusted him enough to claim him as her father. Over her head, he met Eli's eyes and saw tears tracking down the boy's face, silent but unashamed. "Thank you," Eli said, "for giving us a home, for giving us a future, for not turning us away when you could have." Wade's own eyes burned. "You gave me something too. Gave me a reason to be something other than a ghost haunting an empty house. We saved each other. Don't forget that." They finished dinner in a different kind of silence, one filled with unspoken emotion and new understanding. After the dishes were cleared, Eli went out to check on the horses, and Mara settled at the table with her schoolwork. Wade stood at the window watching the last light fade from the sky and felt a peace so profound it was almost painful. The weeks that followed were filled with preparation for Judge Morrison's visit. Wade and Eli repaired everything that needed fixing, cleaned the house until it gleamed, made sure the ranch looked as prosperous and well-maintained as possible. Mara worried about what she'd say when the judge questioned her, practicing her answers until Eli told her gently that the truth was all she needed. Morrison arrived on a warm May morning, his wagon accompanied by a clerk who took notes on everything. The judge spent an hour touring the ranch, examining the stock, the barn, the house. He interviewed Wade first, asking pointed questions about his plans for the children's education, their health, their futures. Wade answered honestly, holding nothing back, and Morrison seemed satisfied. Then came the children's interviews. The judge spoke to Eli first, man to man, in the barn where Wade couldn't hear. When they emerged 30 minutes later, Eli's face was calm, but his eyes were red-rimmed. Morrison's expression gave nothing away. Mara's interview was shorter, conducted in the kitchen while Wade and Eli waited anxiously outside. Through the window, Wade could see Mara talking animatedly, her hands gesturing as she spoke. At one point, Morrison smiled, actually smiled, and Wade felt some of his tension ease. When Morrison finally came out, he gathered all three of them on the porch. "I've seen everything I need to see," he said, "spoken to everyone I need to speak to, and I'm satisfied that this arrangement is in the best interests of both children." Wade's heart hammered in his chest. "So you'll approve the adoption?" "I will. The paperwork will take a few weeks to process, but barring any unforeseen complications, you should have final approval by mid-June." Morrison looked at Eli and Mara. "You two understand what this means? Once this is final, Wade Hollis is your legal father. You'll have his name if you want it, his protection, and his responsibility for you until you're grown." "We understand," Eli said firmly. Mara nodded, her hand finding Wade's and holding tight. Morrison allowed himself a small smile. "Then I'll be back in a few weeks with the final documents. Congratulations to all of you." After the judge left, they stood on the porch in the afternoon sunshine, the three of them, and Wade felt the weight of 10 years of grief finally begin to lift. He'd never forget Sarah and his son, would never stop missing them, but he could carry that loss now without being crushed by it. He had a reason to look forward instead of back, to build instead of mourn. "We should celebrate," Mara said. "This is important." "What did you have in mind?" Wade asked. "A picnic by the creek, with cake." Eli grinned. "I think we can manage that, though maybe Wade should make the cake, given our track record." They spent the rest of the afternoon preparing, Wade baking a simple butter cake, Eli packing food, Mara gathering wildflowers to decorate. As the sun angled toward evening, they carried everything down to the creek where the cottonwoods provided shade and the water ran clear and cold over smooth stones. They ate and talked and laughed, and for the first time since Sarah's death, Wade allowed himself to imagine a future filled with moments like this. He pictured Eli grown and married, maybe running his own ranch nearby. He saw Mara finishing school, becoming the kind of woman who could stand up to anyone and anything. He imagined grandchildren, holidays, the slow accumulation of memories that would replace the ones that haunted him. As the light began to fade and they packed up to head back, Mara said, "Wade, can I ask you something?" "Always." Do you think your son would have liked us? Would he have been okay with us being here? The question pierced Wade's heart, but in a clean way, like lancing a wound that needed to heal. He crouched down so he was at her eye level, the way he'd done that first night. Yeah, he said, his voice thick. I think he would have loved you both. And I think he'd be happy knowing his room became a place where kids were safe and loved again, instead of just a monument to grief. Mara hugged him fiercely, and Eli put a hand on Wade's shoulder, and they stood there by the creek as the stars began to emerge, three people who'd found each other in the darkness and chosen to make a light together. The final papers arrived on a brilliant June morning when the world was green and alive and full of promise. Judge Morrison brought them himself, along with Graham Bridger and Martha Hendricks as witnesses. They gathered in the main room while Morrison laid out the documents on the table. Eli Mercer and Mara Mercer, Morrison said formally, do you consent to be adopted by Wade Hollis, to take his name if you so choose, and to become his legal children with all the rights and responsibilities that entails? We do, Eli said, his voice steady and sure. Mara echoed him, her small voice filled with certainty. Morrison turned to Wade. Wade Hollis, do you agree to take Eli and Mara as your legal children, to provide for them, guide them, and love them as your own from this day forward? Wade looked at these two children who'd stumbled into his life carrying nothing but desperation and hope, who'd torn down his walls and filled his empty house with life and laughter and purpose. And I do, he said. I will. Then by the authority vested in me by the territory of Montana, I declare this adoption legal and binding. Morrison handed Wade the signed documents. Eli and Mara Hollis, welcome to your family. The words hung in the air, momentous and beautiful. Mara burst into tears, happy ones this time, and Eli pulled her into a hug while Graham clapped Wade on the back, hard enough to make him stumble. Martha was crying too, dabbing at her eyes with her handkerchief. You did good, Wade, she said. Sarah would be so proud. They celebrated with cake and coffee, the small gathering feeling exactly right, intimate and warm and real. As the afternoon wore on and the visitors prepared to leave, Graham pulled Wade aside. You know what you've done here, don't you? Graham said quietly. You've shown the whole valley what it means to stand for something, to put people before property, family before fear. There's folks around here who'll remember this, who'll tell their children about the man who fought off armed riders to protect two kids who weren't even his. They are his, Eli said, appearing beside them. They always were. We just made it official. Graham smiled, shook Eli's hand, and rode off with the others. Wade stood in the yard with his newly official children and felt something settle into place deep in his chest. This was it. This was the life he was meant to live, the family he was meant to have. Not the one he'd planned for, but the one he needed. Summer unfolded in a blaze of green and gold. Wade taught Eli the finer points of ranching, how to judge cattle at market, when to sell and when to hold, the business side of running a successful operation. The boy soaked up knowledge like parched earth taking rain, and Wade saw glimpses of the man Eli would become. Strong, principled, capable of hard decisions made with clear eyes. Mara finished the school year at the top of her class, bringing home a certificate of achievement that Wade framed and hung on the wall beside her drawing. She'd made half a dozen close friends and had been invited to 3 different birthday parties, each invitation a testament to how completely she'd been accepted into the community. The frightened, silent girl who'd arrived 8 months ago had been replaced by someone confident and bright, someone who knew her worth and wasn't afraid to claim it. One evening in late July, Wade and Eli were on the porch watching the sunset, when Eli said, I've been thinking about what you said, about maybe having my own place someday. Yeah? I think I'd like that, but not for a while yet. There's more I need to learn, and I'm not in any hurry to leave. Eli paused, choosing his words carefully. This is home, your family. That doesn't change just because I grow up and move out eventually. No, Wade agreed. It doesn't. You'll always have a place here no matter where you go or what you do. That's what family means. I know, and I'm grateful for it, for all of it. Eli looked out at the grassland turning gold in the evening light. Sometimes I think about that night I showed up here. How close I came to dying without ever knowing what it felt like to have a real home. If you turned us away, I didn't. And you don't need to think about what ifs. What matters is what actually happened. You're right, Eli smiled. What actually happened is we found each other, and we became exactly what we all needed. Inside the house, they could hear Mara singing while she set the table for dinner, her voice light and happy and utterly at home. Wade thought about all the moments that had led them here, the desperation, the violence, the slow building of trust, the choice to become family rather than just survivors sheltering under the same roof. You remember what you asked me that first night? Wade said. About who'd feed your sister. Yeah, I remember. I've been thinking about my answer, about how I said I would, and I meant it. But it turned into so much more than just feeding. It became about teaching her to trust again, to laugh, to believe the world could be kind. You did all that for both of us. Wade shook his head. We did it for each other. That's the thing I've learned this year. Saving someone isn't something you do to them. It's something you do with them. We saved each other, Eli. Every single day we choose to be family, we save each other all over again. Eli was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. I used to lie awake at night in Stillwater trying to figure out how to keep Mara alive, trying to come up with a plan that didn't end with both of us dead or worse. And I couldn't see any way out. Until I heard about you. Someone told you about me specifically? Old man who worked in the stable. Said there was a rancher west of here who'd lost his family and lived alone, but who'd never turned away anyone who needed help. Said you were hard but fair, and if anyone would give a dying boy and his sister a chance, it'd be Wade Hollis. Eli turned to look at Wade directly. I walked 30 miles on faith in a stranger's reputation. Best decision I ever made. Wade felt his eyes burn. Best decision I ever made was answering when you knocked. Gave me a reason to keep going. Gave me a second chance I didn't think I deserved. They sat in comfortable silence as the sun slipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple and deep blue. When Mara called them in for dinner, they went together, father and son in all the ways that mattered, ready to sit down with family and share a meal in the house that had finally become a home again. The years that followed brought changes both expected and surprising. Eli grew into a man of quiet strength and steady judgment, someone the neighbors came to for advice and whose word carried weight. At 20, he bought the section of land adjacent to Wade's ranch with money he'd saved and a loan Wade co-signed, and he built a small house there with his own hands. He married a girl from Copper Ridge named Emma, a schoolteacher's daughter with a practical mind and a kind heart, and brought her home to meet Wade and Mara with nervous pride. Mara flourished in ways that exceeded even Wade's hopes. She finished school at the top of her class year after year, then shocked everyone by announcing she wanted to become a teacher herself. Wade helped her apply to the normal school in Helena, and when she was accepted, he felt a bittersweet mixture of pride and loss. She was leaving, but she was leaving to become something remarkable. The night before Mara left for school, they sat together on the porch, Wade, Eli, Emma, and Mara, watching the stars wheel overhead. Mara was 18 now, tall and self-possessed, but she still carried the wooden horse Wade had given her that first night, tucked carefully in her trunk with her other treasures. I'm going to miss this, Mara said quietly. Miss you all. We'll miss you too, Wade said, but you'll be back. This is home. It always will be. I know, but it feels like the end of something. It's not an end, Eli said. It's just a new beginning. You're going to do great things, Mara. Make us all proud. I'm already proud, Wade said. Been proud of you since the day you found the courage to speak again. Since the day you chose to trust that the world could be kind. Everything else is just details. Mara leaned her head against Wade's shoulder, and he wrapped his arm around her, holding on to this moment because he knew how precious and fleeting such moments were. Tomorrow she'd leave, and the house would feel emptier for her absence. But she'd come back changed and grown, bringing new experiences and knowledge, and the family would adapt and grow with her. That was what family did. It changed and evolved, expanded and contracted, but the core of it, the love and trust and commitment, remained constant. Mara left the next morning in a flurry of hugs and tears and last-minute reminders. Wade watched her ride away in the wagon that would take her to the train station, and he felt the familiar ache of loss tempered by the knowledge that this was right. She was choosing her future, and he'd given her the foundation to make that choice from a place of strength rather than desperation. Life on the ranch settled into a new normal. Eli and Emma had their first child, a boy they named Wade Thomas Hollis, and the sound of a baby's cry in the main house was both painful and healing. Wade held his grandson and saw echoes of the son he'd lost, but this time the grief didn't overwhelm him. He could hold both memories, the one of loss and the one of new life, and find peace in the continuation of family. Mara returned from school 2 years later with her teaching certificate and a job offer from the school in Copper Ridge. She moved back to the ranch and rode into town each day to teach, and soon she was shaping young minds the way Miss Pierce had once shaped hers. She brought her students to the ranch for field trips, teaching them about animal husbandry and land stewardship, and Wade found himself giving impromptu lessons to wide-eyed children about responsibility and hard work and the importance of keeping your word. More years passed. Emma and Eli had 2 more children, a daughter and another son. Mara married a young lawyer from Helena who'd come to Copper Ridge to start a practice, and they built a house halfway between the ranch and town. More grandchildren arrived, filling the house with noise and chaos and joy. Wade watched his family grow and flourish, watched the children he'd saved become parents who raised their own children with love and wisdom and strength. He grew older, his hair going fully white, his body slowing down, but his mind stayed sharp and his heart stayed full. On a warm September evening, when Wade was 65 years old, his children and grandchildren gathered at the ranch for Sunday dinner. The table had been expanded with extra boards to accommodate everyone, and the noise was tremendous. Children laughing, adults talking over each other, the clatter of dishes, and the warmth of family gathered together. Wade sat at the head of the table, looking around at all these people who existed because he'd answered a desperate boy's question with a promise. Eli sat to his right, gray beginning to show at his temples, still strong and capable. Mara sat to his left, her eyes bright with intelligence and compassion. Their children, Wade's grandchildren, filled the spaces between, and the great-grandchildren were beginning to arrive, tiny bundles of possibility and hope. After dinner, when the children were playing outside and the adults were cleaning up, Eli found Wade on the porch and sat down beside him. "You all right?" Eli asked. "More than all right. Just thinking." "About what?" Wade smiled. "About that night you showed up here. About the question you asked." "Who'll feed my sister?" "Yeah, that one." Wade looked out at the grandchildren chasing each other across the yard, their laughter carrying on the evening air. "I said I would. And I did. But it became so much more than that. It became a family. It became a legacy. Look at all this, Eli. Look at what came from one moment of choosing to help instead of turning away. All these lives, all this love, all this future, it exists because we chose each other." Eli's eyes were wet. "You gave us everything. A home, a name, a future. I don't know how to thank you for that." Wade turned to look at his son, and Eli was his son, in every way that mattered, and smiled. "You don't have to thank me. You and Mara, you gave me back my life. You gave me a reason to keep going when I'd forgotten why. We saved each other, remember? That's what family does." They sat together in the gathering darkness, watching the stars emerge one by one, listening to the sounds of family and home and belonging. And Wade felt a peace so complete, so profound, that it seemed to emanate from his very bones. He'd spent 10 years as a ghost, haunting the empty rooms of a house that held only memories and grief. Then 2 desperate children had appeared on his porch asking a question he couldn't refuse to answer, and in answering it, he'd found his way back to life. He'd kept his promise. He'd fed Mara, sheltered her, protected her, raised her to be strong and kind and capable. He'd done the same for Eli, watching the broken boy transform into a man of honor and strength. And in doing so, he'd honored the memory of the family he'd lost by building a new family from the ashes of desperation and hope. That night, long after everyone had gone home, Wade lay in bed listening to the familiar sounds of the house settling and thought about legacy. Not the legacy of land or money or material things, but the legacy of choosing love over fear, family over isolation, hope over grief. His son would carry on the ranch. His daughter would shape future generations through teaching. His grandchildren would grow up knowing they were loved and valued and capable of anything they set their minds to, and all of it traced back to a single moment, a dying boy asking a stranger for mercy, and a broken man choosing to say yes. Wade Hollis had lost everything once, and in losing it, he'd learned what truly mattered. Not the absence of pain, but the courage to love despite it. Not the avoidance of loss, but the willingness to risk it for the chance at connection. Not the safety of solitude, but the messy, complicated, beautiful chaos of family. He'd answered Eli's question with 3 simple words, "I will, son." And in keeping that promise, he'd found redemption, purpose, and a love that transcended blood and law and circumstance. As sleep finally claimed him, Wade's last conscious thought was of gratitude. For the children who'd saved him, for the family they'd become, for the legacy of love they were building together. He'd been given a second chance, and he'd used it well. That was enough. That was everything. And in the morning, when the sun rose over the Montana grassland and painted the world in shades of gold and green, Wade Hollis would wake to another day of living the promise he'd made. To feed, to shelter, to protect, to love. Not because it was easy, but because it was right. Because that was what family did. And they were family, in all the ways that mattered. Forever.